In March 2016, I witnessed something that I thought was quite miraculous. It was near the end of a building project that I was involved with in my previous church, and the time came for the cross to be installed on the chapel. And when that happened, I went outside along with our church administrator and also a staff person from Bethany who was our partner in this project. And we started taking some photos of what was happening. It was a very overcast morning, as you can see in the photograph, and that seemed appropriate to me because it was just 2 days before Good Friday. The Bethany officer at that point said, "All we need now is for the sun to break through the clouds." And I responded, "Well, that's what happens on Resurrection Sunday. The sun breaks through." And as soon as I said that, this is what happened. The sun actually did break through the clouds and shone down on that cross. I thought that was a very significant moment, and I felt that it was quite miraculous. You know, there are many dark clouds in our life. There are dark clouds in our world right now, not just to do with this disease, COVID-19, but there are dark clouds of the physical distancing and the social isolation that we feel, and perhaps the emotional distress that we're feeling. There are dark clouds for people who have lost employment and lost income. There are the dark clouds of the economy. There are dark clouds, it seems, all around us. But not only that, there are dark clouds that we find within us in our lives as we journey through life. We find the dark clouds of the things that people have done to us that hurt us. But we also face the dark clouds of things that we do ourselves, things that we do that hurt others, things that we do that hurt ourselves, the dark clouds of failure and brokenness. The good news in all of this is that the cross of Jesus Christ opens a window of hope to the light and the life and the love of the God of the universe. We are in a series at the moment called Trusting God in Troubled Times. And it's based on a part of the Bible written by a man called Habakkuk. Habakkuk lived in the Middle East in a time of great trouble, just over 2,600 years ago. He was a prophet for the nation of Judah, God's people, and Judah was facing the threat of destruction. It was facing invasion from a growing world superpower, the Empire of Babylon, that was actually quite an evil empire. So it was facing the possibility of destruction from without, but also destruction from within, as Judah at that time was being led by a very wicked king who was leading his own people into wicked behavior that really displeased God. And so Habakkuk was deeply distressed by the dark clouds all around him, the dark clouds in his world. And he cried out to God. And what we've seen over the last few weeks is this, just in summary. This is what happened. First of all, we see that Habakkuk cried out to God. Why? He says, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds." But then God responds to Habakkuk. And what God says next in response to Habakkuk is actually really troubling. Part of what God says is this: "I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own." Now, Habakkuk really struggles with this idea. He really struggles to accept that God is behind what is happening. He struggles to trust God in his troubled times. And he says as much when he says to God, "Your eyes are too pure to look at evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent? while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves. I wonder if you feel that way about our current situation. Why would God allow this? God, how could you be in this or behind this or even approving of this? Maybe you have felt that at other times in your life as well. But last week we noticed what Habakkuk did next. Habakkuk decided to stop and to be still and to watch and to wait to see what God would do next, to hear what God would say next. This is what we read in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. The complaint he was talking about was not just his own, but the complaint of his people. And as he waits, God answers him again. And what he hears is also a bit troubling, because what God says is really, in essence, a warning, a very strong warning. Listen to what happens next in this story. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2 says this. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. It will certainly come and will not delay. In other words, God is saying here he's about to reveal a bigger picture, a revelation to his people. And that revelation, that bigger picture is this, that even though God is currently using the wicked empire of Babylon to judge his very own people for their wrong behavior, Babylon itself won't escape. Babylon will also be severely judged for their evil ways. Now, many people struggle with the idea of God being a judge. And perhaps you're one of those people. Maybe you think, this sounds really stern. It sounds really harsh that God would be a judge. Isn't God supposed to be a God of love? And the answer is that, of course, God is a God of love, the God of love, in fact. But how do you think a loving God should deal with everything that is the opposite of love? How should God deal with evil in the world? Should a loving God just give a nod and a wink and turn a blind eye to all the terrible, wicked things in this world? Well, those of us who are parents know that we don't do that. We love our children, but we don't turn a blind eye to the things that they do wrong. And nor does a God of love. In fact, if the God that the Bible talks about just turned a blind eye to all that is wicked in the world, could you really trust him? I don't think so. Now, while we as humans might balk at the idea of God being a judge, I think we are naturally wired to want justice as humans. We want justice in our world, don't we? For example, I wonder how many of us get upset when we see someone who's committed a crime. Maybe they've committed a crime against someone's property or against a person, and they go before the courts and they're convicted, but the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. They seem to get off lightly. And many of us feel very upset when that kind of thing happens. We just feel that justice is not done. Justice is not served. So let's think a bit more about this idea of God being a judge. And let's notice what the Bible says here in Habakkuk about what God actually judges. He goes on to say this. He says, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. He is arrogant and never at rest. You see, God judges arrogance. Now, arrogance is the attitude that the Babylonians had. The Babylonians had the attitude that went like this. We don't need your God, Judah. In fact, we don't need God at all. We're in charge of this planet. and we will take what we want. And there are many humans that have perhaps an attitude of arrogance, an attitude that says, I don't need God. I don't need God in my life. To quote that old poem, I am the captain of my soul. I am the master of my fate. God judges that kind of attitude. But God also judges something else here. He judges greed. The Bible goes on to say in Habakkuk, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied, he gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. God is not happy with the greed of Babylon. They had like a voracious appetite for accumulating things for themselves, accumulating people and nations and land and wealth for themselves. And that is an attitude we find that is rampant in our world, isn't it? An insatiable appetite for more. God says that this appetite is never satisfied, and that's the problem with greed, is that it has to be fed continually. It's never satisfying. God judges greed. But God also judges things like theft and extortion. Listen to what he says as he goes on. He says, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. He says of Babylon, you have plundered many nations. God judges the Babylonians also for oppression and injustice. He says, woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples. And God judges the Babylonians also for violence and murder. God says, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed. And God judges the Babylonians for abuse of people, for the way that they abuse their power and the way that they use that power to abuse people. He says, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskins until they are drunk, so he can gaze on their naked bodies. God judges the Babylonians for these things. And that is good news in many ways, because what it tells us is this, that God does not ignore evil, and he will bring justice to people on this planet who perpetrate evil. God does not ignore evil, and he does bring justice. That's good news for us, isn't it? But there's also an element of bad news here, because these warnings to Babylon are not just to the Babylonians, really. They are warnings to all of humanity. They are warnings to us. Now we might think, well, I'm not guilty of theft or murder or bloodshed or that kind of abuse of people. But what about greed? What about arrogance? Have you ever had the attitude that says, well, I don't really need God in my life. I'm the captain of my soul. I'm the master of my fate. There's another thing that God says that he judges the Babylonians for, and it's something that we're guilty of as well. And it might sound a bit unusual. It's idolatry. God says this, of what value is an idol crafted by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. Now we might think, well, we're a bit too sophisticated to have idols in the way that these verses talk about them. But are we really? Because what this is about is not just about making idols out of wood or gold or silver that look like gods. It's about worshipping what we make. It's about when things become our gods. when things take the place of God in our life. You see, we were created to worship, and if we don't worship the God of the universe, we will worship something. It may not be a carved image of an idol or a god, but it may very well be something to do with gold or silver or our possessions, our house, our bank balance. We will worship something. So that's the bad news. But there is some more good news in this story. And that is this, that even though Judah may see many dark clouds at the moment, God has opened up a window of hope, a window of hope. And we're going to look at that in just a moment. But first, I want us to listen to a brief update from some missionaries that we support over in Mozambique. And they're going to share with us now about their experience of light coming in the midst of darkness.